Whether it be the product of childhood innocence, some form of supernatural psychical phenomena, or simply an elaborate and fanciful imagination, kids seem to have a knack for noticing things that may or may not be there, either way remaining unseen by others. Kids really do say the darndest things, and in keeping with this topic, here are some creepy accounts of children calling out the additional parties present around us. When my son was about 3 years old, we were living with my mom in an old apartment. I had always gotten weird vibes from it. The atmosphere felt heavy and a little oppressive, but I assumed it was just because of the age. However, my son started waking up in the middle of the night and would talk to his friend, who he described as the Hat Man. He would always wake up and tell Hat Man that he didn't want to play with him because he was supposed to be asleep and that he'd see him tomorrow. This was always followed by him waking me up and asking for a glass of water. I knew it wasn't just an imaginary friend when one night I heard him talking, and when he said he would see him tomorrow, the door to his room closed on its own. This stopped completely once we moved out. One day, my daughter came home from preschool and told me she had a new friend that joined her classroom named Susha. I didn't think much about it. My daughter would say things like that she wanted a colorful backpack like Susha's or hair ribbons like hers. One day, my husband asked the teacher to point out which girl on the playground was Susha, and the teacher told him there was no such girl. After that, my husband insisted that this was an imaginary friend and discouraged my daughter from mentioning her. It was several months before she brought Susha up again. We went on a trip to Argentina from California. As we were riding up in a glass elevator in the Buenos Aires airport, my daughter suddenly pointed down into the crowd and said, "Look, there's Susha. She followed us here, even though Dad told her to go away." Neither myself or my husband saw any child where she was pointing. My sister and I had the exact same imaginary friend when she was 6 and I was 5. Her name was Narni. It would freak out our older brother and parents that we both would talk to her and knew exactly where she would be. They would wonder how we both would interact with her at the same time and that our descriptions of her would match. We would even talk about how she would get angry and jealous. Our parents thought for sure that it was the spirit of a child that had passed. When I was little, I claimed to have an imaginary friend who had light brown hair, wore a nightgown, and had stars for eyes. Well, my niece was living at my old childhood home and told me that she has a friend who misses me and asked why I went away. When I asked her who it was, she described my old imaginary friend. It was super spooky. My youngest sister, who was only 4 years old at the time, had an imaginary friend named Paris Jairus. My dad had built her a small playhouse in our backyard where my mom could see and hear her while she was in her kitchen. My sister would have tea parties and such with her imaginary friend. One day, my mom heard her say, "Don't worry, as long as I'm alive, they won't hurt you." She paused and said, "Well, if you do that, then I can't help you. It's not nice to kill people." When my mom asked her what that was about, my sister responded, "Sometimes I have to tell Paris to be a nice person or he can't visit anymore." We moved not long afterwards and she didn't get a new playhouse. When I was 6 years old, we lived in an old farmhouse that was at the very edge of a small village in the Midwest. My bedroom was on the second floor, and the closet had a very heavy wooden door. The latch was old and rusted, which my mom didn't think was safe, so we didn't use that closet for anything. Well, I started sitting in the closet at night with the light on, talking to a nice old man who hung in there. He wore a blue uniform, salt and pepper hair, and a mustache. I had a name for him and everything, Mapo. I talked to this nice old man about my life, my family, my school, and everything. This went on for about a year. My mom found out about it and forbade me from going back into the closet and told me to knock it off with the imaginary friend because it was freaking my little brother out. Now, fast forward several years. There was a town meeting to elect a new mayor for the village, and everyone was supposed to attend. My mom brought my brothers, and I was with her because she couldn't find a babysitter. At the little town hall, which I had never stepped foot in before that night, there was a photo memorial plaque on the wall for a mailman who had been hit and killed by a truck delivering mail to the end of the road I lived on. His name was Ralph Mamo. He looked exactly the same as my imaginary friend, blue uniform and all. A kid once told me that he didn't want to go to church because his invisible friend said he couldn't follow him in there. When I was around 3 or 4, my mom would drive around with me in the back seat, and I'd usually just talk and talk. When my mom used to answer my questions, I'd always tell her that I wasn't talking to her, but I wouldn't tell her who I was talking to when she'd ask. We pulled into the driveway one afternoon, and I said goodbye to my friend named Pappy. My mother told my father some years later and discovered that Pappy was what my father used to call his father when he was little. My grandfather passed away a while before I was born, and my father never shared that name with anyone. When my son was first learning to talk, he would tell us about something called Purple Mommy. He described Purple Mommy as all purple with long hair and bright, all white eyes. At the time, he was mixing up purple with black a lot, so he could have meant she was all black and shadowy. Purple Mommy would pick him up at night and turn off the lights. This creeped me out, as we would often find my son out of his crib in the morning, which would mean him crawling over the railing and to the ground at a time when he was barely walking. I definitely found the lights in his room off a few times too, even though he's terrified of the dark. He also explained that Purple Mommy needed bandages because she had blood everywhere. Purple Mommy could take her head off, and finally, Purple Mommy really didn't like Daddy. He told us all of this stuff for maybe a year or a little more. If we ever asked where she was, he'd always point to the same spot, a corner of the room behind his open closet door. He woke up crying almost every night during this time. Once, during a really rough night, my wife went to ask him what was wrong, and his answer was, "Purple Mommy won't let me sleep." When my daughter was a toddler, she randomly started talking about a man named Don. She always described him the same way and didn't seem scared at all, despite bringing him up every day. She didn't go to daycare, and we didn't know anyone named Don, so I had no idea who it could have been. Then one day she got completely freaked out and wouldn't sleep in her room and wouldn't go around the house alone in case she ran into Don. She started talking about how she hated him because he said mean words to her all the time. About a year into Mean Don, we bought a new house. Once we moved, she never spoke of him ever again. My son, then about 2 or 3 years old, used to tell us about his imaginary friend Johnny, who wore all green, including a green hat. Once we were driving by the cemetery and my son pointed out the window and exclaimed, "That's where Johnny lives." Now, he was very little and didn't even know what a cemetery was, so we explained to him that no one lives there and that it's a place for people who have died. That's when he told us that Johnny lived there because he was a soldier who died in a place named Nam. I had an imaginary friend named Derek who was a carbon copy of me. We were completely identical. I played with Derek for years, longer than what normal kids do, but he would always look at my mom and older sister with a sense of sadness. Eventually, he went away. 23 years later, I was digging through my mom's safe to grab some paperwork she'd kept for me, and I found a stillborn death certificate for a boy named Derek, who shared my birthday. And it was only then that I discovered I was actually a twin, and my brother, Derek, he died during birth. When my son was 3 years old, one day he asked me what happened to the little boy that he used to play with. I asked him who he was talking about, thinking he was referring to his cousin or friends from daycare. This happened in 2020, and those were basically the only kids he saw that year, so it had to be one of them. He said, "No, the little boy I played tag with in the backyard." Well, there had never been a little boy in our yard at that time. I asked if he was thinking about a dream he had, and he was very adamant that there was, in fact, a boy he had played with multiple times in our yard. I was a little wigged out and also was thinking, he's 3, so who knows? About a year later, we were driving to preschool and he said quietly to me from the back of our minivan, "Mom, sometimes I see people who aren't there, that other people don't see." I asked what he meant and tried to get him to elaborate, but he went mum and didn't seem to want to talk about it anymore. He's now 6 and hasn't mentioned any of these friends again. My sister Ashley used to get visited at night by a dead girl with long, dark hair and spider hands. Yes, this predated the ring, and yes, I am old AF. Anyway, she moved out the second she turned 18 and never looked back. 20-odd years later, our half-brother Trevor moved into her old room. It wasn't long after that, Trevor started sleeping on the sofa with the lights on and told us about his new friend that he didn't like. She was a dead girl who had long dark hair and an old nightgown with spider fingers. Needless to say, none of us offered to trade rooms with him. One night I was reading a story to our 3-year-old son and he started laughing. He was looking over my shoulder, so I asked him what he was laughing at, and he answered, the silly little girl by the door is being silly. I looked back, terrified of what I might see, and as I did, he stated, "Oh, Mommy, she ran away." Needless to say, I called my husband at work and told him I would not be sleeping 1 minute that night. My eldest daughter had an imaginary friend that she had when she was 4 years old. His name was Jack, and he lived under our back porch. She said he liked to shove sticks down people's throats. I discouraged playtime with Jack. My 5-year-old daughter was sick one night, so she slept with me whilst her dad slept downstairs. She wouldn't fall asleep and was talking the nonsense that any 5-year-old can talk. She abruptly stopped, snapped her head to look the opposite direction, and said, in a very stern voice, "No, I can't play ball right now, I am busy." Then she turned to me and said, "What? It's just my spirits," before continuing to babble like nothing had happened. Needless to say, I did not sleep a wink that night, especially because we have never used the term spirits around her. My husband was grateful that he got the sofa shift after I relayed this tale to him the next morning. Okay, so let's start with some backstory here. One of my uncles, let's call him Steve, lost a childhood friend when he was about 7 years old. Steve and his friend, let's call him Jack, were having a play date one afternoon and got a bit dirty in some mud. So Steve's mother gave Jack a pair of Steve's shoes to borrow. When Jack's father came to pick him up after the play date, he forgot to put his shoes back on, so he accidentally got into the car still wearing Steve's boots. Tragically, the father and Jack got into a terrible car crash on the way home, which killed 7-year-old Jack. The family had him buried in the shoes he had borrowed from Steve. Now, fast forward 30 years. It's 2010 and we are at a family gathering. My 6-year-old cousin Sarah was alone, playing with her toys in a quieter room of the house. My Uncle Steve went up to her and asked her what she was playing. Sarah responded saying she was playing with a friend. Holding back a smile, Steve asked who her imaginary friend was. She explained that she was playing with his friend Jack, adding he was sorry he forgot to give his shoes back. My uncle's jaw nearly dropped. He had not talked about Jack in years, let alone told that story to a 6-year-old girl. No one had brought up Jack that day, nor at any family gatherings recently. Every time I remember this incident, I get chills. His name was Mr. Nobody. He started as the person the kids would blame if one of them forgot to flush the toilet. And then his mythology evolved. For the record, all of this was conceived by 3 of my kids, who at the time were 6, 5, and 3. Mr. Nobody has no eyes, no teeth, no tongue, and no nose. He doesn't wear pants and leaves the used toilet paper between his butt cheeks so you can tell where he is by his smell. He doesn't wear a shirt and has a pocket cut into his skin where he keeps the key to our house. He can be invisible. He's had a beard since he was a baby. He bites off his fingernails and then drips blood where he walks. Thankfully, it's been a few years since Mr. Nobody has been in our house. During childbirth, I had complications. I almost died, and my daughter actually did. They revived her, and we have been happy and healthy since. But since she was an infant, she's always looked around like she's watching something and just giggling at it. Fast forward to the age of 4, and she told me about her first imaginary friend. Ghostly. All of her imaginary friends are ghosts. To this day, she still talks to them at the age of 7. Unsure if they are real or not, but I'm always sure to be kind to my daughter's ghost friends and invite them along with us. My eldest son, now 20 years old, had an imaginary friend named Barsi. It was a giant wolf, but could transform into a boy. My wife and I didn't think much about it until we noticed that my son had broken a plastic butter knife and stabbed quite a few of his stuffed animals. He told us that Barsi had told him to do it and had even helped. That was when we got really concerned. We took him in to get some counseling after an incident involving a lighter that he found on the ground outside our apartment. He had tried to burn his baby brother's favorite toy. While in counseling, it came to light that Barsi was planning to eat our family and to pee our blood all over the apartment. This was the beginning of my son's counseling and mild medications. Barsi disappeared over a few months, and we were able to take my son off his meds the following year. He remained in counseling for quite a few years, but Barsi was never mentioned again. My daughter started saying Bob before she learned how to say Mama or Dada. She would say it all the time at random times. One time I was in the nursery rocking her to sleep when she said it, and so I asked, "Who's Bob?" She pointed up at the corner of the ceiling behind me. Our youngest daughter asked us to start keeping our bedroom door open because her imaginary friend couldn't open doors. We laughed it off and figured it was just her being afraid and her wanting to be able to see us or know we were home if she woke up in the middle of the night. The next day, I casually asked what her friend did at night, and she said she liked to stand at the end of our bed and watch us sleep. We asked how often she speaks with her, and she said she really only likes to talk and come out at night. We asked her to draw a picture of her friend, and the drawing showed really sharp teeth and a lump on her head. We eventually moved, and her friend didn't come with us, but our daughter said she'd probably find us. That was 8 years ago, and we haven't heard about her since we moved. I'm hoping she's lost. My stepbrother had an imaginary friend named Willa Rose. One night, my mom found the dog dead outside. My brother admitted to killing the dog because Willa Rose told him to do it. The next day, he disappeared. Mom told me he went to go live with Grandma for a while, and I am 21 years old now and have not seen him since. My stepbrother once told me what Willa Rose looked like before he got sent away. Apparently, she was a 14-year-old girl who had died in 1904. She had no eyes but wore glasses, had paper white skin, and wore a ruffled pink dress with olive green stockings. In the past, I've seen things out of the corner of my eye, then glanced to see there's nothing there. Of course, I figured that's just my eyes being weird and stopped paying attention to those weird things. Well, my daughter is currently a toddler, and I recently had her sitting in my lap while I was reading a book. I saw something in the corner of my eye as usual, and my daughter quickly looked over. She then stared, wide-eyed, at nothing, and watched it cross the room. Since then, it's happened 2 more times. She's not yet at the point where she can communicate what she's looking at, but she's getting there. If it happens again, I plan to ask her what she is seeing. We were walking home from a neighbor's house when we walked past a drain hole cover. My son stopped and looked down at the rainwater and said, "There's a little boy drowning down there. His name is Karakari." The name was a combination between 2 Norwegian names. Kari, female name, and Kari, male name. My son is only 3 years old, and we didn't know anyone by these names. And I certainly didn't think he knew what drowning meant. He usually doesn't speak about it anymore, but sometimes he wakes up at night and just points to his baby Bjorn and says, "Karakari don't want to sleep." When my daughter was 4 years old, she had 2 friends when we lived in a rental house. One was named Samantha. Samantha would insist on staying in my daughter's room most of the time. Then my daughter would say that Samantha had to go to bed, and we asked her where her bed was. She very nonchalantly told us she leaves the house when it gets dark and goes out the back door to sleep under the grass. We opted not to investigate further. The other was a man she called Monstressed, or something close to that. He was very nice, according to her, and had long black hair and wore tan pants and funny shoes with no shirt. She said he was usually covered in blue and white and would come and walk around the house and the yard, hanging around and listening to music if we had some on, and he would always stand in the front yard until morning. We've since moved out of that house, and she has not uttered one thing about either friend visiting. I heard my 3-year-old son talking up a storm in his room, pausing as if he was listening to another person answer him. No one was with him, so I asked who he was talking to, and he said, "Grammy. She came for a visit." Grammy was my husband's grandmother who died in our house 3 years before our son was born. We figured she just wanted to spend time with him. She stayed around for a couple of months, then he never saw her again. My friend's son has an imaginary friend named Harley's, and he was the cause of several injuries to that kid. He would come up to his dad and ask for a bandage. When his dad would ask what had happened, he would talk about how his imaginary friend had hurt him. After about a year of them closely watching him, one day it just stopped. Harley's never came back. I don't remember anything about my friend other than his name. His name was Jimmy, and he supposedly was a demon. My mom tells me that I would have full conversations with my window frame, assuming that's where he would stay, and only stop talking when she noticed. She says she'd ask me about where Jimmy came from, and I told her he died and came back from the ground. She never asked about him again, and I don't remember him at all. Apparently, when I was 3 years old, I had an imaginary friend named Ushi, cow in my native tongue. He told me to go for a walk at 1 a.m. in the morning, try and flood the house, etc. I don't remember any of this, but it's kinda creepy. My 3-year-old started talking about her friend named Arlo, telling us stuff she did that was funny. We assumed she was talking about a friend of hers from school and made up stories about them playing together, but we came to find out there was no Arlo at her school. Around this time, it got warmer outside and a new ice cream man started coming around. Our daughter wanted to know why he played music, and we obviously didn't want to listen to her beg for ice cream 6 times a day all summer long, so we told her that he's just the music man and comes to play music. This was right when lockdown was in full effect and there wasn't much to do. She hadn't hung out with any other kids in the past couple weeks. One day, she heard the ice cream man and excitedly told us he's not a music man. He's an ice cream man who sells ice cream. She said, "Arlo told me that you lied to me and said he was a music man, Dad." We asked where Arlo lived, and she told us she lived in her closet.